Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, we have come a long way in our journey to understand the Buddhist teaching.
We have.
So much so, it's hard to cast my mind back to how I felt at the outset. I often hear people asking how to begin that journey themselves. What should one learn? How does one learn? Where should one go? Etc. I find it difficult to respond. There is so much ground to cover. How would you answer such queries?
I would direct them first to what the Buddha himself taught, and then let their interests take from there.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be beginning a short series that introduces Buddhism for true beginners. I lurk in some Buddhist spaces online and I see questions about how to begin all the time. We've been doing this show long enough that it can be intimidating to new listeners. I would like this series of episodes to serve as both a guide to beginners and a good starting place for the podcast. So our primary questions for the day. How do I start as a Buddhist practitioner? What do Buddhists do? What are some resources for beginning practitioners? We hope you enjoy.
We have a lot of episodes out, and we've been on the air for a very long time. So just for the sake of making this episode sort of like a potential starting point for new listeners, we're going to reintroduce ourselves. Much of the info we will give in our intros here can also be found in our Episode 0 trailer, if you'd like to start there. So, I'm Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions, specializing in Japanese Buddhism. I have 2 master's degrees surrounding East Asian religions, and I'm soon to be seeking a PhD researching pre-modern and early modern Japanese Buddhist sacred spaces.
I'm Josh. Online I go by Proven Paradox, Docs for short. I'm an internet nobody who happened to be good friends with Nick before we started the show, with basic podcast know-how. I do production and editing behind the scenes, and mostly set Nick up to speak on the show. A big part of how I do that is asking questions, such as, how do I start as a Buddhist practitioner?
This is a question that we hear quite a lot, typically from Westerners, and I think it's a very important one to address. Something my local monk says is, people love to read about Buddhism, but they rarely go so far as to actually do Buddhism. And this is a sentiment that often rings true. Our show is somewhat guilty of catering to this crowd. We have almost 200 episodes that go into deep discussion of lots of complicated and interesting topics in Buddhism. While reading about Buddhism from reputable sources or even reading sutras is crucially important as a component to practicing Buddhism, you don't actually have to read that much about Buddhism to actually start doing it. Most lay Buddhists the world over have never read a single sutra in the way that a Westerner interested in Buddhism typically would. Most lay Buddhists have recited sutras, and while that obviously requires one to read them, it does not entail intellectual reading for meaning and content, and trying to learn what it's all about. So, reading is not that important for beginning practice. Beginning to practice Buddhism is as easy as beginning to observe the precepts. These are moral rules that are similar to the commandments in Christianity. There are either 5 or 10 of these, depending on what kind of Buddhism you want to practice. The 5 are the following. 1. Nonviolence against all sentient beings. This is a prohibition against killing anybody or any living thing. It leads to some Buddhists being vegan or vegetarian, choosing not to eat any animals that have been killed for food. Vegetarianism is not necessary to all Buddhists, however, and so this is not followed by all of them. For more about Buddhism and vegetarianism, you can refer to our episode 51, How Does Buddhist Doctrine View Food? The link will be in the show notes. Number 2. Do not steal, commit fraud or forgery, or otherwise take what is not given. This is very simple and straightforward, and pretty universally followed to the letter. 3. Do not engage in sexual misconduct. This rule has a wide spectrum. For Theravada monks, it means do not ever have sex, marry, masturbate, be lustful, or anything of the sort. For Theravada lay people, it means to never commit adultery or sexual assault, violence, or impropriety. Mahayana Buddhist monks and lay people both are allowed to marry and to have children, but they must observe the aforementioned rules against adultery and the like. 4. Do not lie or speak ill. This precept has to do with all speech. Don't lie, gossip, badmouth somebody, engage in idle chatter, speak harshly, or speak to cause fights and discord. 5. Do not consume any intoxicants, including drugs, alcohol, or anything that affects one's ability to meditate and practice the precepts. This one is similarly as forgiving as the third precept. Theravada monks are prohibited from consuming alcohol and drugs, but Mahayana Buddhists the world over are generally allowed to consume intoxicants in moderation. The reason why this is flexible is because the definition of an intoxicant is so subjective to a given situation. Is caffeine an intoxicant? Is tobacco an intoxicant? Is marijuana an intoxicant when used to treat pain? These questions are not very easily answered. Moreover, there is no problem seen with using these things in moderation. While there's variation in how these precepts are understood in various sects of Buddhism, they remain fundamental moral exhortations in all of Buddhism, especially with regards to lay practitioners. Monastics have a much longer list of precepts and many more rules to follow, and this list varies much more between sects. However, few people in a monastic context are true beginners to Buddhism, and if they are, they would have a qualified monk teacher who could fill them in. There's also a list of 10 precepts for lay people, but these are expansions or even more specific formulations of some of the aforementioned precepts. The 10 precepts are the following. 1. Do not kill or harm any living thing. 2. Do not take what is not given. 3. Do not engage in sexual misconduct. These 3 constitute the physical action precepts, referring to actions of the body. 4. Do not speak falsely. 5. Do not speak carelessly. 6. Do not speak abusively. 7. Do not speak to cause discord. These 4 constitute the verbal precepts, referring to actions of speech. 8. Do not be greedy. 9. Do not be angry. 10. Do not hold false opinions. These 3 constitute the mental precepts, referring to actions of the mind. As you can see, some of these precepts are shared between both lists, underscoring their importance in Buddhist practice. Though these are the precepts and represent the basic moral rules for how Buddhism ought to be practiced, practitioners must be patient with themselves. It is understood and accepted that these precepts are typically very hard to follow perfectly, so you must be forgiving to yourself if you try and you fail. Trying is better than not trying. Similarly, it is a matter of practice. Like anything else, you'll get better at it if you commit to trying every day. For further recommendations on how to get started as a Buddhist practitioner, I also highly recommend connecting with practicing Buddhists in your local community if you have them. You can seek out a temple, a monastery, or any sort of organization that hosts Buddhists. If you can't find a temple in your area, then you can usually find a temple that streams their services or has some sort of online presence, and so you can always join that group there and hope that you can find some online engagement with them. Of course, different temples appeal to different types of people, so use your instincts and your best judgment. But starting somewhere is better than starting nowhere. I study Buddhism for my career, but I can confidently say that I learned more about practicing Buddhism by going to a local temple than I ever did from reading about Buddhism. Being around real Buddhists makes all the difference.
So, what do Buddhists do?
This is a crucial question for beginners as well, because it relates to how to understand all religions. We could lose our whole lives in the doctrines, the cosmologies, the textual and doctrinal debates, and the historical changes in relationships between all different religions. That's a lot of what we talk about on this show, but it's completely useless information unless it can be understood in the context of what people actually do. In other words, if there's some sort of interesting doctrinal change, but no one's behaviors or their actions change because of it, how does it really matter? If a tree falls in the forest and nobody is there to change how they worship or practice, did it really make a sound? So what do Buddhists actually do? Lay Buddhists typically visit temples on holidays or on a regular basis. They pray and make offerings before a Buddha statue, they recite sutras, and they make donations of food, money, or resources to the temples and the monks themselves. It's very common for East Asian Buddhists to visit temples on New Year's, to make an annual donation and to pray to the Buddha for a good year. South and Southeast Asian Buddhists will also visit temples on holidays, such as the Buddha's birthday or his death day, where they make donations of food, money, or time. Many Buddhists also make offerings of incense, flowers, or food to a statue of the Buddha and then pray to the Buddha for good fortune, for peace, for salvation, and the like. Prayer is much more common in Mahayana Buddhism, but it's still present in Theravada Buddhism. Many Mahayana Buddhists will often also recite sutras. For example, the Heart Sutra is perhaps the most recited sutra ever written. It is central to Buddhist recitation practice. We read and discussed this sutra in an earlier episode, and a link will be in the show notes. Passages of the Lotus Sutra and the Contemplation Sutra are also very often recited. It's also common for the community of lay Buddhists to support their local temple with some sort of donation of time or resources. My local temple has monetary donors, but also lots of volunteers, food donors, and donors of items, such as decorations, appliances, and more. Similarly, we recite the Heart Sutra at every service, and we pray and make offerings of incense to the Buddha. Here, it would be a good idea to stop and discuss meditation. I wanted to set this topic aside from the other beginners' practices for a few reasons. For one, very few lay Buddhists actually meditate, and most of the ones that do are Westerners. Most lay Buddhists, especially from East Asia, do not meditate on a regular basis. The reason why is because meditation and mindfulness has been latched onto by New Age Western Buddhist modernists who have snatched the practice out of its context and turned it into something that can be marketed and sold. Meditation is not just one singular monolithic thing in Buddhism. There's many types of meditation, and none of them is simple or straightforward. It's easy to do it wrong, and it's easy to get entirely absorbed in it and neglect other stuff. For that reason, I recommend starting one's practice with any of the other aforementioned practices. Westerners have taken meditation and have magnified it and given it priority over most other practices in Buddhism. This is fine for people who want to get into meditation, but it's not reflective of what most Buddhists actually do. Meditation also varies across traditions of Buddhism. It includes visualization of Buddhas and heavens, meditative focus on a specific object or concept, or meditation whose purpose is to change your views, beliefs, and opinions. These can be pretty difficult, and they have limited use for a brand new practitioner. Note that meditation outside of the Buddhist context can be useful, but it must come with a disclaimer that not all meditation is Buddhist. Contemplation of something or setting aside time for thinking or feeling your emotions can be really healthy and useful, but that's not necessarily Buddhist. For more information on this, you can refer to Episode 10, What is Jhana? Episode 42, What are the Four Jhanas? And our reading and discussion of the Satipatthana Sutta, all of which will be linked in the show notes. I also recommend episodes 77 through 79, which all discuss secular Buddhism and how it has taken meditation and many other practices and removed it from the Buddhist praxis and historical context and has repackaged it as a cure-all for anxiety, depression, stress, and more.
What are some resources for beginning practitioners?
Not to toot our own horns, but I think that this show is a good resource for some of the basics of Buddhist doctrine, texts, and practices. In addition, I would again recommend connecting with local Buddhists in your area. Anything they say or do has authority over what we say because they're actual Buddhists who practice Buddhism, and this is an educational and scholarly show about Buddhism. They are insiders, while in the context of this show, we are outsiders. For those ready to start reading, I recommend starting with suttas that have been translated into English. I mentioned that reading is not necessary to get started, but it does not hurt either, as long as you start with the right sources. The suttas themselves are the perfect source, because they're not about Buddhism, they are Buddhism. You don't fall into the trap I mentioned earlier about reading about Buddhism without actually doing it. Starting with suttas is a bit harder up front, but the advantages are numerous. 1, you get an impression of what Buddhism is all about, presented by the Buddha himself, not by someone who is trying to sell you a book. 2, you can always go back to suttas the more you learn about Buddhism and the more you do Buddhism in practice. They can always serve as a beginning and ending guide for Buddhism and how to live it. And 3, you can get started learning about the why of Buddhism from the very start. This is all very crucial in my opinion. So much English language popular literature about Buddhism removes the why that governs why Buddhists do what they do, and they often replace it with a post-Protestant morality that purports to be secular. They do this because their audiences are typically responding to Judeo-Christian religious communities and they're from Judeo-Christian places, and this familiar ethic helps them sell books. There are specific reasons why Buddhists observe nonviolence against all sentient beings, or why they recite sutras, And that stuff is just sort of glossed over or omitted entirely in a lot of literature, replaced with bland nothings, such as, because it's a nice thing to do, or because it helps improve your relationships and your career, or because it makes you a more mindful person and unlocks higher levels of consciousness.
I've also observed an emphasis on karma in Western writing and thinking that doesn't really show up in the sutras. The sutras point out that pursuing meritorious karma for the sake of better reincarnation is part of the trap of samsara, that one should try to overcome that urge. It's a trap that Western writing I've encountered either falls into or misinterprets. I suspect there's a quiet, perhaps unconscious parallel to the capitalistic urge to accrue wealth at play.
I agree completely. We've talked previously on the show about how karma does not mean what goes around comes around. People think that if somebody was mean to a barista in the morning and got in a car wreck in the afternoon, that must be bad karma. That's not the correct way to understand it at all. Karma is like moral momentum. The better you are morally, the better your rebirths are, and the easier it is to be ever better morally. It operates outside the conventional and linear timescales, and so it can't be what goes around comes around. Similarly, trying to accumulate as much good karma as possible because you think that that makes you morally superior over others or makes you win at life somehow is actually bad karma in itself, because doing that is really selfish and it comes from a place of selfish thinking. In terms of reading primary texts, I think that the best sutra to start with is the Buddha's first sermon, which we have read and discussed, and which we'll be revisiting in the episode after next. After that, you can feel free to explore any sutras that catch your attention. They're often available for free online with dharmatalks.net or Access to Insight, both of which will be in the show notes as resources. While there are a lot of bad books out there, there are also some good books to start with as well. The first one I recommend is What the Buddha Taught by the Venerable Walpola Rahula. This is written by an actual Theravada Buddhist monk, and it uses sutta quotes to distill and interpret the key essential teachings of Buddhism. I think that this is a good book for people who know literally nothing about Buddhism, but it absolutely must be left behind as one goes further into Buddhism because it has very limited coverage. It discusses an individual Theravada monk's personal opinions about what the essential teachings of Buddhism are, but there are tons of other Buddhists from different sects and schools which have very different interpretations of the key teachings, and so you should expose yourself to as many as possible. It also excludes aspects like ritual, prayer, and other religious trappings, likely to appeal to secular Western audiences. I can also recommend The Heart of the Buddha's Teachings by Thich Nhat Hanh. This book is written by a very famous Vietnamese Zen Buddhist monk, and it attempts the exact same thing as the previous book. I recommend it alongside the previous one because it demonstrates my point perfectly. There will be lots of shared points, but there will also be many points where the two differ on what are the key essential teachings of Buddhism. The third book I recommend is Foundations of Buddhism by Rupert Gethin. This is an academic work that is a bit dated and is not widely used in scholarly circles much anymore, but it contains a lot of key information to the eponymous foundations of Buddhism. It discusses the life of the Buddha, what he preached, and how it all fits into the history of Buddhism at large. Now, I would like to conclude with a brief list of books to avoid in the context of Buddhism. These are books that I believe misrepresent Buddhism and get in the way of one's attempts to practice it, and would lead one astray for a variety of reasons. The first one I would like to recommend against is actually a twofer: Buddhism Without Beliefs and After the Dharma, both by Stephen Batchelor. These two books, and Stephen Batchelor in particular, make the mistake of removing the why of Buddhism. Stephen Batchelor has seen that there is a growing market for people who want watered down and hollow platitudes and oversimplified moral assertions from outside Christianity, and he's catered to that market by attempting to distill Buddhism into something that fills that desire. In doing so, he has removed all of the practical and religious aspects of Buddhism, presenting it instead as basically being the golden rule, with a rationalist flavor instead of a religious flavor, like it has in Christianity. For more on this, visit our aforementioned episodes 77 to 79. These books will absolutely hinder your practice because they posit that Buddhism is not something to be practiced by means of praying, meditating, and changing your morality according to karma, emptiness, and enlightenment. Instead, he presents Buddhism as an empty exhortation to be nice. The next book I recommend against is Buddha's Brain, The Practical Neuroscience of Happiness, Love, and Wisdom by Rick Hanson. This book will get in the way of your practice and understanding because its whole argument is based on the assumption that Buddhism is a scientific religion, which in my view is an oxymoron, and which Buddhism absolutely is not. In assuming that, it argues that Buddhism is supported by neuroscience, and conversely that neuroscience is supported by Buddhism. In making this claim, he misrepresents both. It's a bad book full of bad science. The final book I will recommend against is Why Buddhism is True: The Science and Philosophy of Meditation and Enlightenment by Richard Wright. This book makes the same mistake as the previous book, but it does so instead by evoking evolutionary psychology, which is a flawed discipline of psychology from the ground up. They base their psychological arguments on interpretations of early evolutionary biology. These interpretations are problematically biased toward overly capitalistic and predatory understandings of reality. They argue that every aspect of human physiology, psychology, relationships, and society exists the way it does to increase relative fitness and competitiveness in sequestering resources as a species. This is basically a recapitulation of the core values of capitalism. It understands survival as trying to secure the largest portion of a finite amount of resources for yourself, and success then is measured by how much more you secure than anybody else. This is a clear point where capitalism imposes biases on scientific conclusions. Any up-to-date evolutionary biologist will tell you that this is a bad interpretation. They would tell you much of our anatomy is accidental, convoluted, and poorly optimized. Take our teeth, for example. We live for 80 years, but our teeth typically only survive for 65 of those years if we're lucky. That is suboptimal for our survival because dental infections can be deadly, because losing teeth interferes with our ability to eat, and because once they are gone, they're not organically replaced. In conclusion, this book is a total misunderstanding of evolution, of psychology, and of Buddhism, so I would steer well clear of it.
I would also recommend you search for information about the author before you read any book about Buddhism. Early in my studies, I read The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, nominally by Sangyal Rinpoche. Afterward, I googled the author and found out that he did not practice what he preached, abusing and exploiting people around him. He was publicly named and shamed for this, with the Dalai Lama himself denouncing the man. The book was also ghostwritten. The whole thing is just a poisoned well, and I could have avoided that by just doing a search on the author first instead of last.
I agree. Doing research on the author or on various groups will help you avoid a lot of trouble later on. Just to be safe, I'll also recommend our episode 31, What Are Some Notable Buddhist Cults?, which I'll link in the show notes. This episode is absolutely not exhaustive, but it will help you learn the big cults that are out there and that are worth avoiding, and it will also help present the characteristics of movements within Buddhism that make them into cults, or otherwise make them dangerous or predatory, so that you can evaluate groups on your own and see if they ring any alarm bells in your mind.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion of practicing Buddhism for beginners. Join us next week where we will continue our introductory series and discuss where to find more information about Buddhism. Where can I read and learn about Buddhist history? What kinds of Buddhism are there? What if nobody in my area practices Buddhism? We hope to see you there.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. If you like our show and you want to support us, we ask instead that you send that support to Black families that have been displaced by the LA wildfires. You can find a directory of GoFundMe pages for these families in the show notes. Thank you. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.